matter what it is that you're actually doing. In itself, volunteering is good for society and it's good for the individual. For the person that's actually volunteering, you get work experience, you get something to put in your CV if you're so minded, you get personal development, it opens up your horizons, it makes you see life through somebody else's eyes, it shows you experiences if you're volunteering, for example, with befriending with mind or working with older people. It can open your eyes to somebody else's life, which actually I think can be very valuable in giving you empathy and understanding and making you feel more part of the society in which you live. There's also evidence that people that volunteer have better health, better activity levels and so on as well, so sort of purely from the practical side of things. To the recipient, the person that you're volunteering for or with, not only do they sort of benefit from whatever the service is that you're volunteering, whatever it is that you're doing, but actually the fact that you are a volunteer is incredibly valuable to that person. The fact that you're not being paid to go and talk to them or to go and support them or to do what it is. The fact that you are voluntarily giving your time to do that is in itself an incredibly valuable thing. Actually, the fact that it's voluntary is one of the things that is valuable. So I think if you start forcing people to do it, actually you completely undermine the whole principle behind what people are doing. But volunteering has also got a really massive impact on society. There's a lot of it boosts community vitality because it's building links between people that wouldn't necessarily otherwise meet each other, wouldn't otherwise talk and so on. It can be very, very valuable in making communities stick together much more. It's a sort of social glue of pulling communities together. It also ties in extremely nicely with one of the fundamental principles of the Liberal Democrats, which is that communities are important and that communities should be we should be devolving decisions down. Communities should be taking more responsibility for the type of society that they want to live in, the sort of making decisions on their own behalves. And volunteering and sort of that community feel is a really important part of what the whole principle that the Liberal Democrats stand for. As the decades have gone by, jobs get taken over by the state. People then rely on government or central government or local government to do jobs for them that sort of 50, 60 years ago the communities would have done themselves. And in some ways we've actually lost by that process, because in some ways it can be helpful that you have a professionalised service. In other ways it means that communities have stopped taking responsibility themselves for various areas. And one area of this is around emergency response within the UK. Often communities are just treated as the victims of a disaster. They're not treated as part of dealing with it, part of building it back again afterwards, part of learning the lessons. And I think that we need to be building up much more of that kind of capacity in local communities. This week a couple of times I've met a group based around flood victims, those who were flooded out a year ago, 2 years ago now, I can't remember, all in Gloucestershire and in the north of England. And they've formed a community organisation which is now nationwide, a small organisation, which is sort of picking up best practice, learning the lessons of how it was dealt with and how people are recovering or not recovering from it. And they're using that information to lobby government. So when the government's looking at flood preparedness and things like that and recovery plans, they're trying to make sure that they feed their experiences in. And that's incredibly valuable. A number of years ago, in the last Lib Dem policy paper on volunteering, we proposed a civilian volunteer service, which would be looking at forming sort of reserves of people who are sort of trained up. I suspect a lot of it would be things like the stuff that the Red Cross does around first aid and about sort of some of the response work, so that if something does go wrong, you have a flood or you have something else, that there are people on the ground who have some form of basic training who are able to help out, so we're not entirely reliant on the emergency services, who when you have something like flooding across Gloucestershire, there just simply aren't enough people in the paid services who are able to deal with that, and actually our communities are in a much stronger position to be able to act as well. And I think we need to sort of go back to enabling communities to do that themselves if they want to. And that sort of angle, enabling communities to make their own decisions and enabling communities to act within their own society is really important. And can't be directed, or shouldn't be too directed, from the centre. That is something that is much better coming from the grassroots. But you do need to then have a horrible phrase, an enabling society, a way to allow people to do that, and the support that people need to be able to develop that themselves. And I do have concerns that actually there are so many barriers to people now wanting to volunteer, and to the organisations that are working with volunteers, bureaucracy, the admin and so on, that actually it's in an effort to make volunteering and voluntary organisations more professional, which in itself is no bad thing, we actually have gone a little bit too far, so now it's actually creating barriers for people. One very good example, I think, is the issue around Criminal Records Bureau and the Independent Safeguarding Authority. Clearly we need to make sure that paedophiles are not able to volunteer on their own with children. Nobody is going to disagree with that at all. But the scale of checking and the cost associated with it, not for the voluntary organisations but for society as a whole, and the admin and the burden that generates, particularly for very small organisations who feel that they need to be doing that, I think is really starting to create a barrier for people going into volunteering, and is creating serious problems for some of the much smaller organisations that are working with volunteers in our communities. Baroness Neuberger did a fantastic report into volunteering and volunteers, and she raised some quite serious concerns about the impact of the fear of litigation, which means that everyone's, rather than taking the risk, they're actually making sure that everybody, the gardener that might be working in an old people's home who's volunteering for age concern is CRB checked, which is just bizarre and utterly ludicrous. So I think that is one area where it's gone too far and we need to start rowing it back a little bit. But also the areas around bureaucracy, problems with funding. If you're dealing with short-term funding, you're continually trying to make sure that you know where your next batch of money is going to come from, and that for small organisations can be very, very difficult to manage on an ongoing basis. And also serious concerns around health and safety legislation and or perceived health and safety legislation, what people think they ought to be doing rather than what they necessarily do need to be doing. And I do think that one role for people involved in politics is to really look hard at what the barriers are and whether they are sensible, whether they're there for a very good reason, whether they need to be there, or whether actually it's because we've just got far too risk averse, and whether we need to start looking at what actually needs to be there to protect people and what is just people covering their backs. It's going to be tough for the voluntary sector for the next few years. It's going to be tough for everybody for the next few years because there simply isn't going to be the money around that there has been over the last few decades, or the last decade. But I think partly as a result of that, we're actually going to need more volunteers. The state is going to be rowing back, fewer services are going to be delivered as local authorities, central government are trying to tighten their belts and so on. So there are going to be more gaps for community groups to fill, more jobs that people are going to want to be seen done in their communities, which is going to need more people to volunteer. And also I think there are going to be, as Annie said, there are more people that are going to be wanting to volunteer, wanting to develop skills, those who can't get into work, young people leaving school and college who want to do something if they can't find a job to make sure that they don't end up with a blighted career because they have massive gaps in their CV. And I think that it's going to be a very challenging time both for the voluntary sector but also for those in politics to make sure that the opportunities for volunteering and the enthusiasm that people have for doing jobs in their community, that those are allowed and supported and able to happen even with a smaller financial pot. And I think it is going to be a challenge, but I hope that because of the important role that volunteers play in our communities, because we're going to need that social glue more than ever at a time when you've got higher unemployment and more difficult financial circumstances, we have to find a way through that to enable volunteering to grow and flourish in the next few years.